I commend the bill to the House.
I thank the member for Higgins, and the member for Bruce has the call.
Yes, surprise. There you go, Deputy Speaker. These things happen.
The member for Bruce has the call.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Look, there's no doubt about it. There's no point beating around the bush. Our country has a major skills crisis. The context for that, uncomfortable truths for those opposite, that it comes after a decade of Liberal decay, division and dysfunction. $3 billion of cuts to TAFE on their watch, and who knew? When you cut TAFE for years and they cut courses and close campuses, then you don't train students and you don't have skilled workers. Trashing the apprenticeship system. Who knew? When you do that for years and then in your last year of government you try throwing some money in when the damage is done, then you don't have skilled apprentices, tradies, in the economy. The skills crisis, of course, is a supply-side constraint to the economy. It's driving inflation, it's driving businesses mad who can't find suitable trained workers. It's driving unemployed people to despair as they're forced to apply for jobs week after week, month after month, year after year, which they're simply not trained to do. This bill sets up Jobs and Skills Australia, which is critical to resolving the skills and labour market crisis across the country. Now, what's the opposition position? We heard it today with the little amendment. So after making the mess in their decade in government, they're refusing to work with the government to clean it up. They're moving a silly little amendment so they can vote against the bill. We're not allowed to call them the no-alition. We've been over that, Deputy Speaker, so we won't. But we make the point. Fact is, Australia has the second highest labour supply shortage across all OECD countries. It's also a fact that 3 million Australians lack the fundamental skills required to participate in secure training and work. It's also a fact that as of December last year, just a few months ago, the recruitment difficulty rate for occupations was 65%, which meant 65% of recruiting employers had difficulty recruiting staff. It was even worse in the construction industry, where it was 80% of employers had difficulty recruiting staff. Of the top 20 occupations in demand in Australia, 7 have a shortage, primarily driven by a lack of people with the required skills, and yet unemployment is at 3.5%. Job advertisements over the 12 months prior to January 23 increased by 4.5%. We've got a red-hot labour market across most of the country, and yet we have a fundamental and giant mismatch with the skills that the unemployed population, the underemployed population, and those looking for a leg up, for a more secure job, for a better paid job, actually have. Now, it is because, as I said, a decade of dysfunctional Liberal government that there is this giant mismatch between what skills workers have or don't have and what business needs. An estimated 9 out of 10 new jobs will require post-secondary school education, with 4 of those, Deputy Speaker, requiring VET qualifications. Many of the vital industries that rely on VET graduates are facing workforce shortages. But this giant skills match, this is the key point. It underpins why we need to make this reform for the medium and long term in the context of the former government's failure. Because the giant skills match is no accident. It doesn't just happen overnight. You don't just wake up and go, oh, look, there's millions of people with no skills. It takes years to degrade our skills training base because of this decade of neglect. As I said, $3 billion of cuts to TAFE, courses being slashed, a total lack of care and planning for the TAFE sector. All the talk we had to put up with, the talking points, the press conferences from the former government, the funny little program names, JobKeeper, Job Seeker, Job Trainer, Job Maker, Job Faker, as it turned out to be, but not actually putting anything in place underneath those announcements so people got the skills that they need. While they were announcing more programs, they were cutting TAFE and cutting apprenticeships. But it's hardly a surprise. It was the now Deputy Leader of Opposition, the genius over there, who referred to free TAFE as, quote, wasteful spending. I hope she's learning something on her national listening tour. She popped up last week in my electorate. I think about 25 people turned up from the Afghan community. She didn't like the questions she got. She was asked whether she'd apologise for refusing to give permanent residence. She was asked if she was apologised, and they complained about the questions because they weren't nice. But thankfully, the federal Liberals' colleagues in Tasmania are far more sensible. The State Minister for Skills, Training and Workforce Growth there expressed their excitement to work with the Commonwealth, quote, to continue building Tasmania's skilled workforce. So the Deputy Leader of the opposition over there says that fee-free TAFE is wasteful spending. And yet the one Liberal government left in the country says, actually, this is a pretty good idea. Imagine working with the Commonwealth to skill our citizens. Then, Deputy Speaker, there's their years of trashing apprenticeships, years of cuts, and then in their last year they throw a bit of money at apprenticeships, make some announcements, but it's too little too late. The damage has been done after the decade of neglect. Now, the government is actually taking urgent action to address the skills shortages and to try to match the training participation with the types of skills in demand. We don't need, with respect to many high schools that we all go to and say, well, what would you like? I'd like to be a YouTube blogger. That's not the kind of training we need to be subsidising. We need to be subsidising the training that local and regional labour markets need. Skilled migration, I'd say, certainly has a role to play in boosting our national wealth in certain areas. But our priority has to be always on skilling Australians for the jobs that are available now and the jobs in the future. We can't continue to force employers to look overseas for workers because of the Liberals' failure to invest in skills. That's why, as of yesterday with the budget, Deputy Speaker, the Labor government is creating 300,000 fee-free TAFE places to train Australians in critical and emerging sectors like clean energy and the care sector. Sectors that need workers now with those skills. Who knew? You can train them by incentivising people to go into that training. We're introducing a redesigned Commonwealth Foundation skills program for Australians seeking to develop their language, literacy, numeracy and digital skills. And we're providing more than $54 million in targeted support to apprentice support services to increase apprenticeship completion rates, and the diversity of the apprenticeship workforce as well, to further support particularly women in what are historically male-dominated fields. So that's the context for the bill. Their failure and the impacts in the real economy and the degradation of the human capital of our country because of the failure for a decade to invest in skills, to prepare people for the labour market that we have right now, red hot, crying out for workers. And Jobs and Skills Australia is critical to actually resolving that skills and labour market crisis and building the future workforce that we need. It'll operate, as the bill says, as a genuinely tripartite organisation. Now, here's a trigger warning for those opposite. I'm going to say the word unions. They get a bit upset. That's their little amendment. The only thing they want to do to this bill is get rid of the unions. We don't like the unions. We don't like the workers. That's their amendment. That's the change they want to make to the bill. We say tripartite. Unions, employers and state and territory governments that run the vocational training system. How's that for an idea? Bring together people so they can work as partners. The advice provided by JSA, the independent authoritative source of advice, will be independent, and whilst the minister may request advice from the JSA, she or he will not give direction about the content of any advice. The government is determined to turn around the trend towards insecure, low-paid and unskilled work in Australia. The proportion of people, or the proportion of households where the main breadwinner is on casual, gig economy, insecure work has continued to rise over the last decade. And so JSA will provide the government with data and analysis to build an evidence base by analysing the experiences of affected Australians. Old-fashioned, I know. Public policy should be based on evidence and facts. The JSA will improve identification of labour imbalances across the economy and analyse the supply and demand of skills. The advice will consider tertiary qualifications to ensure there are flexible pathways in place to develop the skills and knowledge needed to resolve those labour imbalances, Deputy Speaker. The bill also expands the JSA's functions. We set it up on a very interim basis to get it up and running late last year after the election. This is the bill to put the flesh on the bones, if you like. It will expand the functions to undertake studies to improve the analysis and understanding of Australians experiencing disadvantage and exclusion in the labour market. People aged over 55, people living with disabilities, migrants, young people, First Nations people are the cohorts that show up in the data. The Labor government's core focus is to create more opportunities for Australians and to build our human capital, to build the skills in the workforce now and in the future. And in order to do this, say it again, you need data and evidence regarding our human capital, and that's exactly what the JSA will provide. The final point I'd just make, Deputy Speaker, is this advice will go into government, it will go into the training sector right across the country. They'll be able to produce regionalised data because, of course, the labour markets are fundamentally different, entirely different in different parts of the country. I'm currently chairing a House Select Committee inquiring into Workforce Australia Employment Services. It's a first principles inquiry. There's a lot of curious and very peculiar aspects to Australia's employment services system. It's based on a flawed theory, I might observe. It's a flawed theory we've had for a couple of decades, that unemployment is always an individual choice, an individual failing, and if only we push the individual, then somehow they'll magically get a job. In some cases, maybe that's true. In some cases, it is true. But in many cases, it's not, because of the structural factors, because of the labour market that you live in, because of your physical disabilities, because of your health, mental health, family circumstances, caring, or the fact that you've never been able to invest in the skills or had society to invest in you. We've designed the system around the very worst people in society, the ones who do cheat the system, and the very worst providers, the ones who try and rip off the government. But that's how we've designed the system, and everyone else is put in that paradigm. I think we can do better. We've designed the system around an incredibly narrow set of objectives, when you look globally, about all of the things that a publicly funded employment service system could do: labour market exchange, human capital development, addressing skills shortages, helping business and industry. We've designed it around a work test. Put all our eggs in that basket. The system is strangely divorced from demand and skills. And so I close on this point. Jobs and Skills Australia can become a key coordinator, collaborator and authoritative input then to the employment services system. The authoritative input developed in collaboration with unions, I said it again, state and territory governments and employers, of advice on labour market needs and skills needs to inform both the skills training system, the higher education system and our employment services system. So I commend the bill to the House, and I suggest the opposition withdraw their silly amendment. We can all go out, we can say it together, we can hold hands, we can say unions, they represent workers, and then they could vote for the bill.
I thank the member for Bruce for his very insightful contribution.